She is widely acknowledged and collected nationally and shortlisted for every prize just about that she's eligible for. And I have been a fan of Anita's work for a long time, and I'm lucky to own a piece by Anita, which was actually a commission for a birthday, which was a very interesting process, which we may or may not talk about. And obviously you've seen the exhibition downstairs. You know that one of the most significant and distinctive things about Anita's work is her use of felt and so-called broken objects. So today I just want to tease out a few of the things that make this work so powerful and so affecting to so many people, because I've rarely met people who are not moved by Anita's work and don't have quite a sort of profound emotional reaction to the work. I want to go back quite a long way, Anita. I want to go back to you as a little girl and what sort of things you did when you were about 7 years old that is really the starting point that leads to this exhibition.
I grew up on a farm, and my parents were building their house in the 70s, and in that time the tip was kind of an open place. I don't know if many of you probably remember. It was just a huge mountain of things. And as kids, that was our Saturday outing. We went to the tip and collected things, and we were allowed to climb all over the tip face and collect whatever we thought was interesting and take home, because it was all free. You didn't have to buy it from a shop like you do now. And that kind of started my interest in things and how they form stories when they're randomly piled on top of each other or juxtaposed with each other in some way.
Do you remember what sorts of things you salvaged, and can you remember what you did with them as a child? Like, did you make dolls out of them? What did you do with the stuff that you collected?
I wasn't a child that was into dolls. On a farm, all the children do all the tasks, so I was driving the tractor, milking the cow. I wasn't really a child of dolls. But we kind of made just random stuff, just imaginative things. We made our own cubby houses, we made flying foxes, and just random things. But I can remember clearly when I found a Barbie doll that had its head off and it was lying next to a wheel of something else, and I thought, that's really weird and interesting, that's all I thought. I didn't think it was going to be anything, I just thought it was really interestingly strange.
Yeah. So that immediately appealed to you, that juxtaposition of the headless Barbie and the wheel, and so presumably you were thinking maybe about the wheel as a substitute for the head.
Well, I think most children do that. I think that over time adults tend to lose that. Or get it drummed out of them, or suppress it in some way. Whereas I kind of nurtured it my whole life, and now I can't see objects without that. I don't see them as practical things. I see them as animated things.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So let's just then leap forward. So you're growing up on a farm, you've got chores, you've got tasks and responsibilities on the farm. Can you remember then your first experience of seeing art and recognizing art as art? Do you know where that was?
It was probably in my high school library, and it consisted of painting, a whole shelf of painting books. There was not one sculpture book. And I think, it probably wasn't until I went to art school, Sydney College of the Arts, that my world opened up. I had some great teachers there, Tom Arthur, Nigel Hellier, Lindy Lee, I really shone there, I guess.
And at what point then in that trajectory of being an art student did you come across the idea in the tradition of art that was made from found objects and the material of felt, which of course, you know, there's a very long tradition of felt in contemporary art. So at what point did you connect with those things?
In my third year, I was making works in paper, and I was casting people's bodies, like with a plaster mould, and then making a positive using paper. And I was interested in the fragility of the body. And as kind of artists do, you kind of meander on a path, and then you get to, I won't call it the end, but you've resolved something that you needed to resolve at that point. And then I thought, okay, so maybe I flipped that interest in fragility upside down, because our bodies do actually mend really well, extraordinarily well. And having gone through childbirth, I know that they mend. And they have a strength and a resilience to them, our bodies, which is extraordinary. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And was investigating different materials, experimented with rubber, because it has that kind of pliability and stretches and comes back into shape. But then I found felt. So I did just an ordinary weekend course at community college, and I was hooked with the process, because during the process of making a felt, each tiny little hair, because of its mechanical structure, travels in response to your friction that you create with your hand. So it has this kind of spring nature about it, and it responds to your pressure. And because it's travelling in these random circular patterns, they all get in a big tangle with each other, and this forms the felt. And in that travelling, there's this shrinking process. So the felt works that you see of mine have all started out twice the size of what they end up. And it kind of stretches and mends itself in response to your rubbing. So it does have a very much a skin-like quality about the actual process.
And obviously you love the process because it is so organic and so tactile. At what point, though, did you think about creating this kind of second skin for objects? So you talk about cocooning these objects in this skin of felt, and downstairs we've got the examples of everything from a vacuum cleaner to violins. So at what point did you decide that you wanted to wrap objects in this stuff?
Well, it's a little bit different than wrapping, because the felt is actually made, it grows around the object. So it's a lot more organic in its making than making a flat piece of felt and cutting and stitching it and wrapping it around an object. So if you look at the felted works, there's no end. It's almost like it has grown itself this second skin. And because there's no cutting and no stitching and no end or opening, it entirely encloses the energy of the object, if you want to call it energy.
Okay, so that's an interesting concept in and of itself. We might tease that out. So why, I can see that there's something very sculptural about the shape of a violin, even more so when you kind of put two violins together. You sort of get that effect where they look like a gecko on a wall, where you can't tell which is the head and which is the tail. But with something like a vacuum cleaner, there is no more mundane, banal, practical piece of functional equipment that we all have in our home. What appealed to you about the process of creating this second skin around a banal object like a vacuum cleaner?
Well, the vacuum cleaner is cut and stitched, so it's not that second skin concept.
Right.
But my interest in the vacuum cleaner connects to my interest in breathing things, in things that are bodily like. So most of the objects that I use have a direct relationship to the physicality of our bodies. So the chairs that you're sitting on, there's a direct relationship between how your body is collapsed into the chair and how that chair is supporting the shape of your body. So these types of objects interest me a lot. And the vacuum cleaner, it tends to be like a lung to me. So it kind of sucks and blows, and maybe that's a little bit simplistic. But that particular vacuum cleaner, I expanded up into 1.5 times its size. So it's actually it's a model of an actual vacuum cleaner, which is quite small and bright orange. And I scaled it up to the size of my torso. So it's become a body in itself.
Right. So in previous exhibitions now, I remember there have been other references to breath. I think that you made a piece once which had a sort of glass central piece, and that was also about breath coming in and out of a sort of a glass stomach. Am I right in thinking of that? Or a lung?
Yeah, that particular piece of glass was the size of my rib cage, so that's again the capacity for my breath. But breath is quite intriguing to me because I use breath in my meditation, and it also connects directly to emotional states. So, if you're a little bit anxious, then your breath will speed up, and you can, vice versa, if you are anxious, you can actually purposefully slow your breathing down, and it will calm your body and your mind. So I find this connection that we all have with breath very interesting. It's also what connects us to each other. So maybe we don't need to talk that through during COVID, but as I'm talking, there's breath coming out of my mouth, and as you're sitting there, you're breathing, and some part of you is expiring into the air. So we are all connected through our breath. And not only that, but we are connected to all the plants that are on this planet, because our out-breath gives them some sustenance. It's quite an interesting, invisible but present.
It's one of those things that we do completely unconsciously, and from things that I've been reading recently, most of us are breathing badly most of the time. So we're breathing shallowly when we need to be breathing more deeply. So there's an awful lot about the way the body functions that we take completely for granted, but when we bring our awareness to it, we realise that we should be doing it actually completely differently.
Yeah, and the breath also, it connects to my interest in illness and health and brokenness and repair. So when my father was dying, I saw him take his last breath, and there isn't a finite number of breaths that we all have. And my son, when he was born, he took his first breath. There's it is connected to whether we exist or not. Yeah.
Very directly.
Yeah.
And yes, it's a privilege in a way to be able to experience the first or the last breath of any fellow being. It's not always an easy process, either at the beginning or the end, but it is an important thing, I think, in terms of humanity to witness. You've made that kind of more concrete or more visible in a way in one of the photographic works, where you kind of show us a sort of felted bubble of breath coming out of your mouth. So
between myself.
Between your two selves.
Between your two selves.
That's the first time that I've seen you put yourself into a work so visibly, so concretely in terms of the photograph. Can you just talk a little bit about that piece?
Usually I consciously employ the body through my visible actions of repair. So I generally show, the way that I've mended something or, constructed something. So usually the body is implied, and often by the way that the object or sculpture is, leaning against the wall or these types of things. But my next body of work that I'm doing for my doctorate is about what happens if you flip that over and have the body represented in relation to the objects. So my interest in objects is directly about the body.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because even then you just said body of work. So, there's the play on that word. And then when you think about the chair and you think about the fact that, certain pieces of furniture, we say that they have a carcass or we say that they have ribs. So in fact, the shared language of a lot of the materials that come to you broken have body parts ascribed to them, like the legs of the chair, the arms of the chair.
Yes. Yeah, they do.
They do. And I know that you keep lists of words that resonate for you, and that you've got quite a sort of penchant for sort of puns, which I think in a way also kind of comes out in your work as there's a lot of wit to your work, and I think there are sort of visual gags in your work.
Well, I think a lot of the works express my own personal difficulties. Like I've had a lot of trauma in my life and a lot of sadness. But I think, when the works are intuitively about that, you do need to kind of temper that with some lightness, otherwise it just drags everyone down. And I do, even in the difficult times, there's an absurdity about that. Like I always find something funny about an awful situation.
You do.
It just tends to be my sense of humour.
So one of those one of the works that illustrates that might be the bed, the very, very, very long bed. So you might just want to tell us what the genesis of that, because I think one of the things that's really wonderful about talking about your work this way is that it makes us realise how deeply autobiographical the work is, and the bed really illustrates that.
So the bed, there's a few ladders in the show, and they're representative of my ex-husband and I. So we separated last year, and the difficulty that relationship had. So the bed, its length is the measurement of he and I toe to toe to each other, because sometimes when you're not getting on, the bed's just not big enough. I just want to go and sleep at the other end. So there's that kind of, that was the impetus for making that work.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah, I don't think you need to know my story, and I think that too many women actually get parcelled into how their work relates to their personal lives, and I think that the works are strong enough to sit outside of that.
Yes, it's a sort of secret code that's embedded in the work, but it's not made explicit. It's not the overt thing that's driving the work, because there are other concepts and other ideas that come into play.
I've got quite an interest in, although I do like words and playing with words, it really fascinates me how artworks can bypass the cerebral part of your brain and hit you in the gut or the heart. And so I called the work Come to Me Without a Word, the exhibition. I'm just really interested in how material language can affect us so viscerally.
I think the work's very, very eloquent and there is a kind of talismanic quality to the work. that sort of transcends the verbal. I want to ask you about one particular piece where you use a material I haven't seen you use before, which is fragments of x-rays that you've cut up, interspersed with a broken chair. So obviously there's human injury and the notion of repair and brokenness there, but can you just tell us a little bit about that piece?
So all of the objects that I use come to me broken in some aspect. Contrary to what some people think, I don't create the brokenness, I don't take them apart. They come to me already fragmented, and that begins this kind of action of care that I have, I guess, toward the object, and it develops the thought process to what happens next. So with this chair that you mentioned, I found it on the side of the road, and it was broken and missing parts, and it was kind of slumped, tangled on top of itself, really like a body. It looked like a body already to me. And it wasn't such a leap to think about the chair as bones for me. And I was also at the same time reading for my research about kintsugi. So this Buddhist method of repairing broken ceramics by inlaying the cracks with gold lacquer. And it's the cracks or the flaws in this broken thing that are its beauty, but also its meaning. Also, it gives it richness. And that in Buddhist philosophy, that transfers into our own lives. So the brokenness that we all individually feel also gives your life depth. And it also connects you to other people who go through similar difficulties. So this kintsugi I used to repair, well, not traditionally repair, but repair the broken parts. So I cut out the broken parts and filled them with gold leaf. And those parts that I cut out, I used my x-rays to connect my body with the chair. This is convoluted. My body with the chair, and remake the silk parts and sew them directly back into the chair. So there's little drill holes going through each of the chair segments, and I used a really long needle to thread the silk back into the chair. So they're conceptually connected to each other, the two parts, but they're also physically connected by my actions, the two parts.
I love something that you said actually in a recent interview, where you said that you thought that brokenness was more of our general natural state than being unbroken. And I thought, what an extraordinary way of seeing the world, you know, kind of flipping the way we normally see things. Can you just expand on that idea a little bit, or how you came to that realization for yourself that, you know, most people are broken or scarred or damaged in some way, and that is more normal than thinking that we're not?
Just seems really logical to me. It just is.
Yeah.
Like if you talk for any length of time to any one of the people here, they will have a deep story of brokenness, and you carry that with you through life. So to kind of pretend that you can get to this state of being whole is kind of weird. Like, although we all strive for that, I think it's kind of a natural state to be broken, and that's what's great about human nature. You know, that's where all bonds us together. But also, in the physical world, I actually manage a repair space at the same tip that I went to when I was 6 or 7, and in like everything that comes in there is in some state of brokenness. And even in your own house, you're constantly having to do maintenance. Like everything is in a state of brokenness.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
One of the things that is so interesting about the works downstairs that you might miss on the sort of first pass is another sensory element, which is the element of smell, and using the materials of wax and honeycomb. So I was wondering whether you could say something about the tactile appeal of the wax and how you came to work with that material.
Well, this occurred because I met a beekeeper, and she and I were talking because I'd already been thinking about making objects in beeswax, and we actually put some of the objects into her hive, and they started to make their honeycomb onto the tennis racket, and this was quite interesting. I'd like to develop that a bit more. But also I got the two beehive lids that came in, and it was just really interesting to me and really struck me that the pattern that the bees make when they're starting the honeycomb is the same as a human spine. And it just really struck me immediately, and I thought, oh, I have that x-ray of my own spine, it'd be perfect. It was just like, bang.
I didn't get that. I saw the cells, the replication of the honeycomb as human cells.
Oh, yeah, so that light box that I made, that it's kind of the beehive lid and then my x-ray, and then it's got electrical cord that's kind of like at the place where an umbilical cord would come from my x-ray to connect me to my mother. So that work extended into an interest in, I don't know, the associations that can be made by talking about bees. They're very interesting little creatures. And I think also humans are very much like an enclosed beehive. Like, you and I know each other, and we might get to know each other really well, but I can never know what it's like to be you, on the inside of you. And this is kind of similar. We're all like these kind of little beehives. Once you open the lid of a beehive, you disturb all the bees inside, and it's never the same as when it's closed in that same state. Yeah. And I really like that beeswax is responsive to body heat. So the beeswax hot water bottle that I made, the objects that I use, I think about the bodily relationship that we have with those objects. So with a hot water bottle, you're hugging it, you're cradling it for some comfort when you're in pain or because it's cold. Or so to heal yourself, you hug this object. And I find it quite interesting to flip that object into something that would actually melt if you stayed in this relationship to it for too long.
And there's also some cloves that you've embedded in some work. So again, that's a sort of another dimension of aroma. So what was that about?
Cloves are associated with healing, so they have an aesthetic property to them. So I filled some of the felt works with cloves. And I've also used sound too this time. So there's the beehive beeswax sound speaker thing has a beautiful recording by Brent Williams about, he recorded the sound of the bees and then fed it through a synthesizer, a computer program, and played with it, did his magic to it. So part of it is a natural sound and part of it is man-made and part of it is like somewhere in between. So making these associations between nature and human beings. We're all animals, even if they're to be the human. Yeah.
There's another sort of, another kind of material, another kind of textile in the show, and that's, there's blankets and sheets, I think, well, there's linen. And there's something very satisfying about a very neatly folded pile of linen. It always makes me feel organised. Sometimes if I need a bit of reassurance, I might open the linen cupboard and see that everything in there is kind of in order, and I might get the illusion for 5 minutes that life is,
I don't want to invite you to my linen cupboard.
Listen, it's not looking good today, but what's interesting to you about piles of linen, like the ones that you've used in the show?
Well, that particular work is about the role that women often end up with. Yeah, if ever there's kind of a crisis, it's always the woman that, it seems to me, the woman that ends up doing the dishes or making the dinner or folding the sheets. So, not always, but that's kind of my experience. And so it's a little bit about, women's role in the domestic environment.
Okay. Yeah. So let's switch to more masculine, traditionally masculine kind of imagery for a moment. I think one of the most beloved pieces in the show is the cricket ball. The cricket ball with the nipple. It's just, everybody loves that piece so much. So how did you arrive at that?
Again, my interest is in the bodily relationship to the object. So the cricket ball, it actually gets a lot of attention. Like if you've watched a cricket game, there's a lot of this breath rubbing, kissing, this kind of going on. So that's always my starting point with the object is what is the bodily action that happens with that object, and how can it be pushed into meaning something? Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, when you get those cricket balls, when you get a cricket ball in a state of disrepair, where are they coming from? Where do you find those?
Oh, they're everywhere.
Are they?
Yeah, you just go to a cricket ball match and they're like, the ones that are no good, they end up being used for practice or in the creek or, they're just everywhere.
Okay.
But people give me things too. Yeah, it's not hard to find broken stuff. Yeah.
Let's just stay with the key sort of joke of the cricket ball for a moment, because it is that you have added a nipple to it, and nipples have become quite prominent, as it were, in some of your work.
Well, it's my nipple too. So I took a mould of my breast and made it in plaster so that it was solid, and then I wet the leather, moulded the leather, dyed the leather, stitched the cricket ball. So I learned a lot about how cricket balls are made in that process. I do have an interest in the crafting of things, I guess. Yeah.
But there are other nipples there. There's the ping pong bat.
Yeah.
What is it about the nipple?
That's even funny. I don't think it's such a big deal, but anyway. Well, I think it's really interesting our complex relationship to breasts, especially as a woman who's breastfed her son. There's sexual things, they're things that we keep hidden all the time, but they're also our first touch to another human. And they're also nurturing things, they're life-giving things. So it's I find them very complex and not so, people just think they're funny, but I think there's a lot more depth to them than the joke, yeah.
Yeah, so it's about the ambiguity and the many layers of meaning that you can attach to it.
Yeah, and that is quite interesting, when you're in a relationship that they're kind of sexy things, and desired things. And then once you have a child, there's kind of, the child has ownership of this thing, which all you mothers would, nod in your heads. So it becomes the child's breast, and then when you're weaning your child, it suddenly becomes back to you. And there's a changed relationship there to your own body. It's interesting.
Just continuing on with that theme then of the body, I know you've got a really fantastic project coming up shortly, which is a hospital-based project, and I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I can tell you what I know. So the Maitland, the old Maitland Hospital it has a vast number of objects in its basement rooms that are just piled in, jam-packed, hundreds of crutches, 50 wheelchairs stacked on top of each other, all this medical equipment, files of all people's records, and they're working on the curator's working on a project to get a group of artists together, one of whom is myself, to use these objects to make works about repair and healing, but also about the hospital, the experience of being in a hospital and being cared for and caring, so the staff that used to work there. So that will be it's going to be shown at Maitland Gallery July next year.
You're going to be in your element there.
Yes.
No one's going to get a look in. You're going to grab all the wheelchairs and all the crutches and say, that's mine. It's like a playroom for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a perfect little gig for me.
It is. Now we have a special treat to finish off this afternoon, which is there is one of Anita's works behind us, which is a hybrid creature, which is a crutch violin or a violin crutch, and it's going to be performed for us this afternoon by Jane Aubourg, who's a Wollongong-based violinist, composer and maker. Her performances, compositions and installations are often based around looping, and her sound draws from folk, minimalism and experimental music. She also writes, plays and explores with the new music collective, the Music Box Project, who recently won the APRA Art Music Award for Excellence in Experimental Music. And she's always looking for new ways to explore and play with sounds and objects. So, Jane?